Red Bull did not escape Monaco because the wing looked normal. They escaped because the rulebook could not stop it. Straight mode was banned. The actuator pod had no job. And in that one empty space above the rear wing, Red Bull found something every team in Formula 1 is hunting for. Free downforce. Not illegal downforce. Not hidden downforce. Legal downforce, sitting inside a loophole that nobody wanted to admit was real until Monaco exposed it. And that is what makes this so dangerous. Because the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile allowed the car to run. The wing passed scrutineering. No penalty came. No disqualification came. Red Bull's controversial design survived Monaco. But survival is not safety. Mercedes used the same gray zone. McLaren used it too. The paddock saw everything. And now the next question is no longer whether Red Bull were legal at Monaco. The real question is whether the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile lets this loophole live long enough for Red Bull to use it again. Because if it stays open, every team will copy it. If it closes, Red Bull loses one of the few clever weapons they found in a season where Verstappen needs answers fast. So was this a genius Red Bull comeback move, or the first warning that their best ideas may only last until the next technical directive? Subscribe to the channel. For Red Bull, the most important word after Monaco was not speed. It was permission. Because the controversial wing did not survive the weekend by looking ordinary. It survived because, under the wording of the rules, the space Red Bull used was still available. The car passed the checks. The design remained on the car. No penalty arrived. No disqualification arrived. And for one crucial Monaco weekend, Red Bull had taken a piece of the rulebook that looked like a dead zone and turned it into performance. That is the kind of thing Formula 1 teams dream about. But it is also the kind of thing that makes the entire paddock nervous. Because when a loophole is confirmed by survival, every rival immediately understands two things. First, the idea works. Second, the clock has already started. That is the strange danger Red Bull now faces. Their wing was allowed, but the attention around it may be the beginning of its end. In Formula 1, a clever part can be completely legal on Sunday, and still be living on borrowed time by Monday. That is exactly why Monaco matters. The whole story began with a decision that had nothing to do with Red Bull specifically. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile disabled straight mode for the entire Monaco weekend. The reason was safety. Monaco is narrow, slow, and lined with barriers. There is no proper safe stretch where a car can change aerodynamic state without creating unnecessary risk. The tunnel exit, the short bursts of acceleration, the closed walls, the lack of runoff, all of it made active aero too dangerous for this particular circuit. So straight mode disappeared. And when straight mode disappeared, the rear wing actuator lost its purpose. That actuator normally moves the wing between its two states. It exists because the active aero system needs a mechanism. The rulebook created a special space for it, a small actuator pod zone above the rear wing, with different dimensional freedom from the main wing surfaces. At a normal circuit, that makes sense. The hardware needs somewhere to live. But Monaco created the unusual situation. The system was disabled. The hardware was unnecessary. The legal space remained. And that is where Red Bull saw the opening. To most people, this sounds like a tiny technical detail. A small pod. A small box. A few pieces of bodywork that almost nobody would notice from the grandstands. But Formula 1 is built on tiny technical details. A championship can turn on a millimeter. A qualifying lap can turn on one extra bite of grip. A driver's confidence can turn on whether the rear of the car feels planted when he applies throttle out of a slow corner. At Monaco, those details become even more powerful. Because Monaco is not a track where cars stretch their legs on long straights. It is a place where everything is compressed. The corners. The margins. The decisions. The consequences. A little more downforce can help the car rotate. A little more rear stability can help the driver attack the throttle earlier. A little more grip can make the difference between brushing the wall and finishing the lap cleanly. So Red Bull looked at the actuator pod zone and asked the most Formula 1 question possible. What can we place there? The answer was winglets. Small aerodynamic surfaces, mounted around the pod, designed to squeeze extra downforce from a space that was never meant to become the headline of the weekend. And here is the key point. The winglets looked strange because they sat higher than the normal permitted height for the rest of the rear wing. To the eye, that makes them feel wrong. They look like they are living in forbidden air. They look like something that should not be allowed. But the actuator zone was different. It had its own legality box. And that box was the loophole. Red Bull's design was especially interesting because they kept the actuator pod and repurposed it as part of the structure. Mercedes used the same general gray area in a more aggressive way, removing the pod concept and building a more complex multi-element structure. McLaren also explored the opportunity. That mattered, because this was not one team hiding a forbidden secret. It was multiple teams reading the same regulation gap and coming to the same conclusion. The space was there. So they used it. That is why the wing being legal is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the conflict. Because Red Bull can say, correctly, that the car was allowed to run. It passed through scrutineering. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile was aware of the designs. There was no confirmed ruling that Red Bull had broken the rules. No confirmed new evidence proving illegal behavior. No Monaco disqualification. But rivals can answer with something just as powerful. Was that space ever intended to be used this way? That is the battle between the letter of the rule and the spirit of the rule. The letter says the bodywork fits inside an allowed zone. The spirit asks why that zone exists in the first place. And the answer is awkward for Red Bull. The zone existed to house an actuator. It existed because active aero needed moving hardware. It was not clearly designed to become a free aerodynamic platform whenever the actuator was not active. That does not make Red Bull illegal. But it does make the idea vulnerable. And in Formula 1, vulnerability is often the first step toward a technical directive. That is the threat hanging over this entire story. A technical directive does not have to punish what happened before. It can simply clarify what is allowed from now on. It can say, this space may not be used for aerodynamic winglets. It can close the door without rewriting Monaco. It can turn Red Bull's legal trick into a temporary trick. That is why Red Bull's legal victory is so uncomfortable. They survived the weekend. But they may have lost the secrecy. And secrecy is everything with a loophole. Before the paddock understands an idea, it has value. Once the paddock understands it, there are only two futures. Everyone copies it, or the governing body closes it. Neither future gives Red Bull a private advantage for long. That is why this moment is bigger than the rear wing. It reveals the tension inside the entire 2026 rule set. The new active aero system created new bodywork zones. Those zones were written for specific mechanical functions. But Formula 1 engineers do not stop at the function. They read the shape, the limits, the exclusions, the measurements, the exact wording. If the rule creates a box, they will ask what else can live inside it. If the rule leaves a gap, they will ask how much lap time that gap is worth. If a system is disabled for one weekend, they will ask which parts of the system can be repurposed before anyone stops them. That is not a Red Bull problem. That is Formula 1. But for Red Bull, the timing makes it personal. This is not the Red Bull that ruled the previous era with overwhelming confidence. This is a team trying to prove it can still lead under a new regulation set. The car has shown weaknesses, especially on rougher surfaces and over curbs. Verstappen has needed more answers than excuses. Ferrari and Mercedes are not waiting. McLaren are close enough to matter. So every clever gain feels important. Maybe too important. That is why the actuator winglet mattered so much. It was not just a clever Monaco-specific solution. It was a sign that Red Bull are still dangerous enough to find performance where others might only see in used hardware. But it also revealed that Red Bull may need these margins more than before. A dominant team uses loopholes as weapons. A pressured team uses loopholes as lifelines. And lifelines can be cut. That is the emotional weight behind the legality confirmation. Red Bull can point to the weekend and say the design was allowed. They can say this is exactly what great teams do. They can argue that Formula 1 rewards innovation, not hesitation. They can argue that if the rulebook leaves a legal space, then the smartest team has every right to use it. And they would be speaking the language of Formula 1. But the rivals can speak that language too. They can say the rule was written for an actuator, not for winglets. They can say the extra height allowance was never intended for pure aerodynamic gain. They can say the governing body must stop the actuator zone from becoming a new loophole war. They can push for clarification. And if enough pressure builds, Red Bull's advantage disappears. That is how regulatory battles work. They rarely begin with a dramatic punishment. They begin with discomfort. A design looks unusual. A rival asks a question. Technical media explain the idea. The governing body studies the wording. Then suddenly, what was accepted becomes restricted. The part was legal. Until the rule caught up. Red Bull know this pattern well because they have lived on both sides of it. They have been accused. They have accused others. They have watched rivals challenge wing flexibility. They have seen designs pass one weekend and face new tests later. They understand that the rulebook is not fixed in practice. It moves when the paddock forces it to move. That is why this legal confirmation is not simple relief. It is a warning. The wing survived because the current wording allowed it. But the controversy may motivate the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile to tighten that wording. And once that happens, Red Bull may need to replace not just a part, but an entire line of development thinking. At Monaco, that line of thinking was clear. Active aero removed. Actuator zone available. Winglets installed. Extra downforce gained. Legality survived. But what happens at the next circuit where a similar opportunity appears? What happens if the governing body says no? What happens if every rival arrives with a more aggressive version? What happens if the actuator zone becomes so crowded with clever bodywork that the original purpose of the allowance disappears entirely? Those questions matter because Formula One cannot allow every exception to become an arms race forever. At some point, the rule makers must decide whether a loophole is healthy innovation or a distortion of the regulation's intent. And Red Bull may have forced that decision sooner than expected. The irony is that the legality confirmation may have made the situation more urgent, not less. If the design had been instantly banned, the story would be simple. Red Bull tried something. It failed. The paddock moves on.